History remembers ancient Greece as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and beauty. But hidden beneath the marble palaces was a nightmare few dare to speak of. Female servants, the invisible backbone of royal households, endured punishment so sexual, so degrading, and so cruel that their suffering was erased from memory. In this story, you will learn how women inside Greece's palaces were whipped, violated, silenced, and mutilated, not as crimes, but as accepted punishments designed to keep them obedient. In the grand courts of ancient Greece, the brilliance of art, philosophy, and power often disguised the silent chains of women who lived in servitude. Palatial life dazzled visitors with banquets, statues, and symphonies of political debate. Yet just beyond the decorated corridors existed a world where women were reduced to shadows. Female servants were not merely workers. They were property. Purchased, inherited, or gifted between nobles, they existed at the mercy of their masters. Their daily labor ranged from attending the queen's chambers to preparing meals, but their bodies, unlike their hands, were never truly their own. A female servant's silence was her greatest survival tool. Speaking out, resisting an order, or even showing defiance in her eyes could result in punishments designed not only to wound, but to humiliate. Greek palaces perfected this system of control by using women's sexuality against them. They were forced into a cycle where the very essence of their womanhood was weaponized as a tool of obedience. Unlike slaves in the fields, palace servants lived in close proximity to power. This closeness made them more vulnerable. Noblemen, sons of aristocrats, and even visitors could exercise rights over these women. To refuse was unthinkable. Refusal could lead to beatings, public stripping, or sexual assault carried out in front of other servants to reinforce dominance. A chilling account survives in fragmented records. Servants caught gossiping about their mistress were dragged before the court, stripped naked, and flogged while nobles jeered. The intent was clear. Their humiliation was entertainment, their pain a warning. The lash left marks, but it was the violation of their dignity that scarred far deeper. Even more disturbing was how these punishments blurred into rituals of discipline. Servants accused of carelessness might be paraded half-clothed through courtyards, forced to endure the stares of soldiers and officials. This spectacle reinforced hierarchy. The palace was a stage where power was performed to the suffering of the weak. Sexual punishment was so normalized that it rarely counted as a crime. A master forcing himself upon a servant was not considered rape in the legal sense. It was viewed as an extension of ownership. For the women trapped in this system, there was no recourse, no justice. Their voices were silenced by the very culture that celebrated liberty and philosophy. One haunting story speaks of servants who dared to resist. For their defiance, they were subjected to punishments that combined sexual cruelty with mutilation. Some had their hair shaved publicly, stripping them of dignity. Others were branded, their thighs burned with iron so that their defiance would be permanently marked. Silence was survival. And yet, silence was also punishment. In palaces where whispers could topple reputations, some women who spoke against masters were condemned to a fate worse than death, mutilation of the tongue, ensuring they could never again utter defiance. To be forced into sexual servitude and simultaneously denied a voice was to become a living ghost within marble walls. The contradiction of Greek culture remains striking. A civilization remembered for logic and philosophy built part of its foundation on cruelty toward the vulnerable. In the palace, brilliance and brutality coexisted, with the latter often hidden in shadows, whispered but rarely written down. These women were not free. They were not wives, not citizens, not even considered individuals. They were living extensions of their master's will, enduring degradations that Greek philosophers never addressed in their celebrated texts. Their chains were not only made of iron, but of fear, humiliation, and silence. And so, beneath the marble grandeur of Greece's most celebrated palaces, The cries of women were muffled into history. Their stories surface only through scattered records, fragments of law, and whispers buried in ancient texts. What they endured was not merely servitude, but a calculated system of punishment designed to strip them of humanity, turning flesh into obedience, silence into survival. In the palaces of ancient Greece, sexual violation was not seen as a crime, but as a weapon of power. For the noble households that owned female servants, the use of a woman's body became a form of punishment, meant to humiliate, control, and silence. Obedience was not expected, it was extracted through terror. When a servant disobeyed, neglected her duties, or was simply accused of disrespect, punishment was rarely limited to physical pain. Instead, her humiliation was made sexual, turning her body into the arena where control was asserted. A woman could be stripped in front of others, forced to stand naked before her masters as her vulnerability became part of the lesson. This public display was often followed by forced intimacy, not in private, but under the watchful eyes of others, ensuring that the shame was as enduring as the pain. Greek law offered no protection. A servant woman had no standing in the courts, no legal identity, and no rights over her own body. For the master, she was both property and punishment. To touch her, to use her sexually, or to expose her before others was not considered violation at all, it was considered discipline. There are disturbing accounts in scattered writings that suggest noble sons were, sometimes encouraged to train their authority on servants. The degradation of these women became a test of masculine dominance. To humiliate a servant sexually was not an aberration but a demonstration of power, legitimized by status. The psychological cruelty was immense. A woman who had been used in this way was often paraded afterward, her humiliation spoken of openly among the household. Shame was transformed into a chain stronger than iron. If she resisted again, the punishments escalated, whipping, confinement, or branding, but almost always with a sexual element woven into the violence. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect was how normalized this practice became. For the palace elite, the suffering of servants blurred into routine. To order a servant's body used as punishment was no different than ordering a meal or commanding a soldier. The casualness of the cruelty made it even more terrifying, for it meant that a servant could be punished at any moment, for any reason, in ways that violated not only her body but her very humanity. Female servants endured an impossible paradox. They were expected to be present, to dress their mistresses, serve wine at feasts, prepare chambers, yet invisible when their bodies were abused. Their role was to disappear into silence after being degraded, to carry the shame privately while continuing to smile and serve publicly. To show resistance was to invite deeper cruelty. One fragment of testimony reveals a chilling custom. A servant accused of stealing food was stripped before the household, flogged, and then handed over to soldiers for the night. Her punishment was not simply about theft, it was about breaking her will through sexual violation. Her suffering was meant to be retold in whispers to frighten the others. In this way, the palace system ensured obedience not by chains alone, but through psychological terror. Women learned that their bodies could be turned into their greatest vulnerability at any moment. They lived in constant fear, watching every gesture, every word, every breath, knowing that the smallest mistake could lead to a punishment that left scars far deeper than flesh. To call this discipline was to hide the truth beneath the language of power. These punishments were not about correction, they were about domination. They reduced women to objects, stripped of identity, stripped of dignity, stripped even of the right to name their suffering. And so, within Greece's most celebrated palaces, the philosophy of freedom and democracy coexisted with a system where women's bodies were routinely destroyed in the name of order. Violation was not hidden, it was displayed. Discipline was not justice, it was cruelty made flesh. In the palaces of ancient Greece, the whip was not only a tool of discipline, but also a weapon of humiliation. For female servants, Lashes across the skin were rarely delivered alone. The sting of leather often came with another layer of cruelty, sexual degradation that made their punishment unforgettable. Whipping was public. A servant accused of disobedience or insolence was dragged into a courtyard, stripped, and bound where others could see. The act was never about correction. It was about breaking her spirit. Every lash was a message to the rest of the servants. Your body does not belong to you, and your dignity can be taken at any moment. But the lash itself was not considered enough. In many cases, the whipping was combined with sexual violation. A woman might be flogged until her back burned red, then forced to endure groping or forced acts while still bound and trembling. The pain of the whip prepared the stage for deeper humiliation, ensuring she left not only wounded but shamed. Witnesses to such punishments were often other servants, sometimes even noblewomen, who were expected to watch as an example of hierarchy preserved through cruelty. To see a fellow servant whipped and used was a warning that no one was safe. In this way, terror was spread through spectacle. Greek texts rarely describe these punishments openly, but fragments survive, hints in plays, letters, and court accounts. Some speak of female slaves forced to serve wine with lash marks still fresh on their bodies, proof of their master's dominance. Others describe punishments where women were flogged across their thighs and buttocks, making even the act of sitting afterward a reminder of their subjugation. The cruelty went further when nobles treated these scenes as entertainment. Feasts sometimes ended with the punishment of a servant, her cries mixing with laughter and music. What for her was agony became, for others, amusement. The blending of punishment and pleasure exposed the darkest truth. Violence against these women was not just tolerated, it was enjoyed. The whip also carried symbolic meaning. To mark flesh was to remind the servant that her body was never her own. Scars were permanent signatures of ownership, branding her with memories she could never erase. Even when the wounds healed, the psychological scars endured, shaping how she moved, spoke, and obeyed. What made these punishments so devastating was the merging of physical and sexual pain. The lash stripped the body of dignity, and the violation that followed ensured the humiliation sank deeper than the skin. The women who endured such punishments carried within them a silence shaped by fear. They knew that speaking out meant even harsher cruelty, perhaps mutilation, perhaps death. The contradiction of Greek culture stands stark here. A society that worshipped the human form in sculpture and art was equally capable of destroying the human body in reality. The same civilization that praised beauty in marble treated living women as vessels for pain. For the servants of the palace, the whip was more than leather. It was a sentence, a ritual, and a promise. You will be broken until obedience is carved into your flesh. In ancient Greece's palaces, cruelty was not always carried out in secrecy. At times, punishment became ceremony, humiliation became ritual, and the suffering of female servants was transformed into a public display of power. These moments were not accidents but carefully staged performances, designed to remind everyone of their place within the rigid hierarchy of the court. During festivals or special occasions, when nobles and officials gathered in celebration, servants often became unwilling actors in spectacles of degradation. A woman accused of disobedience might be stripped and paraded through the palace halls, her shame witnessed by hundreds. Her humiliation was not hidden, it was showcased, a ritual intended to both entertain and terrify. In some accounts, women were forced to carry torches or offerings while naked, their bodies displayed as symbols of obedience and submission. Such punishments were often justified under the guise of purification or discipline, but in reality they served to strip the woman of dignity, reducing her to an object in a performance of dominance. The blending of ritual with cruelty made these punishments even more insidious, for they carried the illusion of cultural acceptance. The ceremonies of humiliation could be elaborate. Servants accused of gossiping or resisting their masters were sometimes dragged into banquets, bound and displayed before feasting nobles. Their bodies were exposed as laughter filled the halls, their suffering woven into the fabric of the celebration. For the masters, it was a demonstration of control. For the servants, it was an inescapable nightmare. The public nature of these punishments left scars beyond the body. To be humiliated before an audience, stripped of clothes, stripped of speech, stripped of humanity, was to endure a death of identity. Even after the event ended, the woman remained marked. Other servants avoided her, fearing the same fate. Her humiliation became part of palace memory, repeated in whispers long after the wounds had healed. One chilling practice involved servants being forced to kneel in silence for hours, naked and exposed, while nobles passed by. Any movement or expression of shame was met with additional punishment. The women became living statues of submission, reminders that power in the palace was absolute and that disobedience would be met not just with pain, but with utter degradation. The cruelty of these rituals lay in their dual purpose. They punished the individual but also reinforced the system itself. Every servant who watched learned the same lesson. Resistance was futile, and the body was not sacred, but a tool of power, to be displayed and degraded at the master's will. Perhaps the darkest truth is how normalized such rituals became. In a culture that celebrated theatrical performance and ritual ceremony, the humiliation of servants was absorbed into the rhythm of life, hidden beneath the grandeur of Greek tradition. What for the victim was unbearable suffering became, for the audience, a spectacle, an echo of power dressed as ceremony. For the women trapped within these palaces, ritualized humiliation ensured that their suffering was never private. It was broadcast before the eyes of their masters and peers, searing their shame into memory. And within those marble walls, their bodies became instruments of a performance they could never escape. Behind the polished marble walls of Greece's palaces, luxury and refinement disguised a darker reality, hidden chambers where servants were forced into sexual servitude. These private spaces, often referred to in whispers as gynaikeia or women's quarters, were more than living quarters. For many female servants, they were prisons, brothels maintained not for profit, but for the pleasure and politics of the elite. A palace servant's body was never her own. When nobles entertained guests, women of the household were sometimes offered as tokens of hospitality. What appeared outwardly as generosity, the master's ability to provide every indulgence, was in truth a ritual of exploitation. Servants had no right to refuse. To deny a guest was to risk flogging, mutilation, or worse. Sexual punishment was woven into this system. A woman accused of disobedience might be ordered into these chambers, forced to serve multiple men as part of her discipline. The act of being handed from one man to another was meant to erase her individuality, reducing her to nothing more than a vessel for use. The violation was both physical and psychological, ensuring that humiliation lingered long after the act itself. Some accounts suggest that young girls were deliberately chosen for these roles, their innocence exploited as part of the spectacle. Their masters framed it as a test of obedience. To resist was defiance, but to submit was to accept one's place as property. The cruelty was compounded by the fact that these encounters were not secret. Other servants often knew, whispering of who had been sent below after angering a mistress or master. In certain palaces, these brothel-like chambers became tools of politics. Alliances could be sealed with the offer of a servant girl, her suffering hidden beneath the language of hospitality. Soldiers were rewarded with access to women, ensuring loyalty. Officials were entertained with what was described as pleasure, though for the women, it was a punishment disguised as privilege. The sexual details of these punishments reveal the depth of degradation. Servants were sometimes forced to appear before drunken banquets, stripped of clothing, their humiliation made into a form of spectacle before being taken to the hidden rooms. Others were required to perform acts while still marked with bruises or lash scars from earlier whippings, their bodies doubly wounded, first by violence, then by forced intimacy. For the victims, there was no distinction between punishment and assault. Both blurred into a single nightmare of degradation. The body was no longer flesh and blood but property, endlessly taken, endlessly used. A woman who had endured such nights often emerged silent, eyes lowered, stripped not only of dignity but of the will to resist. Even noble women were not blind to these practices. Some mistresses used the system to punish servants they distrusted, ordering them into the chambers as a form of vengeance. The palace brothel was not only a place of pleasure for men, but also a weapon wielded by women in power, a cruelty that cut across gender. History remembers Greece for its philosophy and beauty, but in these hidden rooms, a darker truth endured. The very civilization that sculpted ideals of love and beauty also normalized the systematic violation of women, who could never speak of what they endured. The palace brothels were not temples of desire, they were chambers of punishment, where flesh was currency and suffering was tradition. In the rigid world of Greek palaces, silence was both demanded and enforced. Servants were expected to be invisible, present when summoned, voiceless when abused. To speak against a master's advances, to whisper about a mistress, or to resist humiliation in public could mean punishments that attacked not only the body, but the very ability to speak. For women, the most terrifying punishment of all was being forced into silence while their bodies remained exposed to exploitation. The command was simple: obey without question, submit without voice. A servant who cried out during an assault might be gagged, bound, and forced to endure in silence, her muffled sobs ignored by those watching. In time, silence became ritual, a condition imposed even during punishments, where the absence of protest was treated as submission. Historical fragments describe practices of mutilation. Servants accused of gossiping were sometimes condemned to tongue mutilation, cut partially or entirely, leaving them unable to speak clearly again. For a woman already degraded through sexual punishment, the loss of speech meant the erasure of identity itself. She could be used but never heard. The cruelty did not stop at mutilation. Some were forced to wear gags or bits of wood in their mouths during sexual violations, both as a symbol of their silence and as an added humiliation. Their inability to speak transformed them into objects, robbed of the final shred of human agency, the power to cry out. In other cases, silence was imposed through ritual humiliation. A servant might be stripped, her mouth bound shut, and displayed before a gathering of nobles. While men mocked her, touching or violating her as they pleased, her enforced muteness was turned into spectacle. She became a living reminder of what awaited any woman who dared to speak against her masters. This punishment had a psychological effect more devastating than scars. Silence followed these women everywhere. Even when not bound or gagged, they learned to lower their eyes, to swallow words, to choke back resistance. They lived in a world where to speak was to invite mutilation, where even a whisper could cost them the ability to ever speak again. The sexual element of these punishments deepened the cruelty. A woman forced into silence while assaulted was stripped of the last form of defense, her voice. To endure pain in silence was to suffer twice, once through the violation itself, and again through the forced suppression of her humanity. Greek society praised rhetoric, philosophy, and the spoken word, yet within palace walls, women were robbed of speech in the most literal sense. Men debated justice in public squares, while their servants bled in silence behind marble walls. The contradiction was glaring and intentional. Power thrived on silencing those who suffered. For many, death became preferable to this existence. A mutilated servant, branded, silenced, and humiliated, carried her punishment long after the act. She was present but erased, visible but voiceless, a ghost trapped in flesh. The punishment of silence was more than mutilation. It was erasure. It ensured that the suffering of palace women would vanish into history, unspoken, unnamed, unheard. Their pain became a secret buried within stone, surviving only in fragments and whispers, a chilling reminder of how cruelty can silence not only voices, but entire lives. Fire has always been a weapon of power, a force that scars not just the flesh but the mind. In the palaces of ancient Greece, fire was turned into a tool of domination. Branding female servants with hot irons was one of the most terrifying punishments they could endure, and it was often bound to sexual humiliation. When a servant resisted her master's advances, when she was accused of disobedience, or even when she displeased a mistress, she could be branded like livestock. Heated metal rods were pressed into her skin, often on her thighs, breasts, or lower abdomen, intimate places chosen deliberately to degrade. These marks were not only scars, but symbols of ownership, announcing to all who saw them that the woman was broken and belonged to someone. The branding was often carried out publicly. Servants were stripped, bound, and held down as the iron hissed against their flesh. Their screams echoed through marble halls while nobles watched, some treating the scene as entertainment. For the victim, the agony was unbearable, but worse still was the knowledge that the scar would never fade. Her body itself became a permanent reminder of subjugation. Sexual punishment was intertwined with this ritual. A woman branded on her thighs might be forced to expose the scar whenever she served wine or attended her mistress. Others were humiliated further, forced to endure sexual assault immediately after branding, their fresh wounds used as part of the cruelty. The pain of fire combined with violation created a punishment that lived in both flesh and memory. Branding also functioned as a warning to others. Women marked in this way were stigmatized, their scars speaking for them even when they could not. A branded servant carried her punishment into every interaction, her body silently reminding others of the consequences of resistance. Masters used this terror to enforce obedience across the household, ensuring that no woman dared to refuse. Some accounts suggest branding was also used to settle jealousy. Mistresses, threatened by their husbands' or sons' attraction to female servants, sometimes ordered the women branded as a form of disfigurement. In this way, fire became a weapon wielded by both men and women in power, leaving servants caught in a cycle of cruelty they could never escape. The branding irons themselves were symbols of hierarchy. Shaped into letters, symbols, or even household emblems, they marked the servant as property. Just as cattle bore the mark of ownership, so too did these women. The permanence of the scar made escape futile, even if they fled. Their bodies betrayed them, ensuring they could be recognized and punished again. The psychological devastation was profound. A woman branded in such a way carried not only pain but shame. Intimacy was forever poisoned, for her body was not her own. Every glance at her scars reminded her of her degradation. Every touch reminded her of her subjugation. In the grandeur of Greece's palaces, where art and philosophy flourished, women's bodies were seared with fire to enforce obedience. Branding was not discipline, it was domination made permanent. It ensured that servants did not simply fear their masters, but bore their cruelty carved into their very skin. In the palaces of ancient Greece, death was not always the ultimate punishment. Sometimes, it was the only release from unending torment. For many female servants, death came as a grim mercy, a final escape from lives dominated by sexual cruelty and humiliation. When a servant defied her master's will, especially in matters of sex, her punishment often escalated until her body could endure no more. Repeated assaults, endless humiliations, branding, mutilation, and public degradation left some women so broken that execution seemed almost merciful. For those who resisted long enough, death was the inevitable conclusion, not swift, but ritualized, often in ways that reinforced the absolute power of their masters. Some were strangled with their own garments, silken robes twisted into nooses around their throats. This method carried a chilling symbolism. The same clothing that once made them appear desirable became the instrument of their destruction. Others were drowned in palace fountains, their naked bodies displayed before the household before being discarded. These deaths, staged as public lessons, reminded other servants that resistance led not only to pain but annihilation. The most horrifying were those executions tied to sexual punishment. In certain households, a servant accused of refusing her master's bed was paraded half-naked through the palace before being beaten and executed. Her body became both spectacle and warning. There are accounts, whispered and fragmentary, that women were sometimes violated even in their final moments, forced into submission before being silenced forever. The cruelty was deliberate. Death was not just punishment, but the master's last act of dominance over a woman who dared to resist. Mistresses, too, used death as punishment. A jealous wife who feared her servant might rival her in beauty or charm could order her killed, often after orchestrating humiliating punishments that broke the woman's spirit. A drowning in a bathhouse, a poisoning during a feast, or an arranged accident in the palace gardens, each disguised act of murder removed a rival while reinforcing the unspoken rule: the servant's life was expendable. What made these deaths even more horrifying was their framing as justice. Masters would claim the servant had been disloyal, had betrayed trust, or had brought shame to the household. In truth, most of these accusations masked a cycle of abuse, where refusal or resistance was treated as treason. Death became the final punishment, but also the master's way of rewriting history, ensuring the servant was remembered as guilty, not victimized. Yet, among the other servants, the truth was known. Whispers spread in kitchens, in hidden chambers, in the quiet corners of the palace, that another woman had been destroyed, not because she betrayed her household, but because she resisted cruelty too long. For these women, death was both terror and release. Some even prayed for it, preferring the silence of the grave to a lifetime of scars, humiliation, and endless violation. In the end, the tragedy of these servants was not only in their deaths, but in how those deaths were used. Their executions were not moments of justice, but performances of control, reminders that in Greece's palaces, life and death both belonged to the master. And sometimes, only in death could a servant truly reclaim her dignity, spared from the horrors that defined her existence. In the grand halls of Greece's palaces, cruelty was not hidden in shadows. It was displayed. Punishments against female servants became a public performance, a form of theater that reminded all who watched that power was absolute. What should have been private acts of discipline were transformed into rituals of humiliation. Servants accused of disobedience were stripped, bound, and paraded before nobles. Some were forced to endure sexual assaults in front of gathered witnesses, not out of lust, but as punishment, a deliberate desecration of their dignity. Their bodies became stages upon which authority was written. The pain was real, but the deeper cruelty was in the public laughter, the whispered mockery, the cold indifference of those who treated suffering as entertainment. Public punishments often blurred the line between justice and spectacle. Women were flogged until their skin split, forced to crawl naked before their mistresses, or branded in front of the entire household. Some were paraded through the palace with marks of shame carved into their flesh, their degradation made permanent and visible. The humiliation was not only for the victim, but for every servant who watched, a reminder that they were powerless, that their bodies were not their own. This spectacle of shame reinforced the culture of silence. Few dared to resist, for they had seen what happened to those who tried. Yet the memory of such punishments lived on, not in official records, but in whispered stories passed among servants, in scars carried from one generation to the next. By the end of such rituals, the servants were no longer seen as human beings. They were transformed into symbols, warnings, objects, tools of fear. Their suffering became a weapon, ensuring obedience through terror. And yet, beneath the silence of the palace walls, the echoes of their pain remained. When the torches burned low and the nobles retired to their chambers, The palaces of Greece seemed quiet. But in that silence, countless women's stories lingered, unspoken, unwritten, buried beneath marble and memory. The female servants who endured branding, mutilation, assault, and execution rarely had their names preserved. History remembers kings, philosophers, and conquerors, but not the women who served in their palaces, who suffered in their shadows. Their lives, erased from scrolls and monuments, survive only in fragments, in mentions of punishments, in legal codes, in the silence of omission. And yet, their absence speaks louder than any preserved text. Their suffering was not an accident of history, but a deliberate system, one that used sexual violence, humiliation, and terror to enforce obedience. Their voices were stolen, their dignity shattered, their humanity denied. But their pain left marks, even if unseen. The tragedy of these women lies not only in the cruelty they endured, but in how that cruelty was normalized. To their masters, it was discipline. To the court, it was order. To history, it was silence. And in that silence lies the greatest injustice of all. What remains are echoes, the memory of scars burned into flesh, the image of women paraded in shame, the knowledge that countless lives ended not in rebellion, but in quiet suffering. They were women whose names were never written, whose stories were never told. Yet their silence demands to be heard. In remembering them, we uncover the darkest truth of Greece's palaces, that beneath the marble, the feasts, and the philosophy, there was cruelty so profound that only death could end it. And though history buried their voices, their echoes remain, haunting, accusing, unforgettable.